goal here. As far as tax cuts, now, there are a lot of people who suggested that the 2017 Trump tax cuts were going to lead to inflation. That didn't actually happen. Why? Because it turns out that allowing people to keep their own money is not the same thing as simply pumping government money into the system.
Okay, let's hear how he explains this. Okay, I so want to hear this. Tell me, please.
Allowing people to keep their own money, American consumers and American investors act with actual rationality with regard to their own spending and investments, which means they don't just blow money into the economy willy-nilly.
They absolutely do, but okay.
If there's a tax cut, people tend to use that money to not only pay off their bills in a responsible fashion, but they also tend to make economic decisions that help them and their families, as opposed to the government, because the way the government spends money is it finds...
Wait, what?
...who use that money to not only pay off their bills in a responsible fashion, but they also tend to make economic decisions that help them and their families.
What do you think economic decisions to help them and their families means? What is he saying here? I don't even know this is what I was talking about before when I'm saying, like, give me a question, I'll try to spitball you an answer. What a worthless statement. They use money to make economic decisions to help their families? Okay.
As opposed to the government, because the way the government spends money is it finds particular constituencies that it likes, and then it throws money at those constituencies. Special projects that government wants that don't have to be profitable, that can be absolutely profit neutral or negative, and just tosses money at them. And that can be absolutely projects that government wants that don't have to be profitable, that can be absolutely profit neutral or negative, and just tosses money at them. And that creates artificial inflation in areas where there is no concomitant productivity.
I mean, like, while that's kind of true, but it kind of depends. I mean, like, there are some things that the government spends money on that make money for the government, though. So, for instance, obviously, investing in the IRS to collect taxes is a good way to do it. Also, there are multipliers in dollars spent in, say, one thing that I remember reading in the past has to do with birth control. If the government or state governments, I think in California, I was reading this, that there's a multiplier effect for every dollar spent in birth control. It's like $18 saved or whatever, and if you don't have like a child, in terms of how much money the state would have to spend taking care of it or providing welfare or tax breaks or whatever. So there are places where the government can spend money, but it's hard to recover the costs of that. Like, there wouldn't be a profit in doing so. Like, if a private company were to give free birth control, they're not going to make money on it, but the state government can. So, the goal of every government policy is not necessarily to be profitable. There are some things that we should invest in that might be really hard to turn a profit on. But
right, the reality is that new products, new innovations, initially that means that people spend money on those innovations at a higher rate, and then as there's competition, the prices come down. That's what happens when you allow people to keep their own money. But that entire incentive structure is broken by government spending. So tax cuts and government spending are not remotely the same thing, and only a person who believes that all money basically comes from the government equates those two things. Me allowing you to keep...
Well, I mean, in a literal, strict sense, if we're going to be this rudimentary about it, doesn't all money kind of come from the government? Like, why do you get paid in USD and not any other currency? It's because you can pay your taxes or the government in USD because the government forces everybody to accept USD and because the government creates USD for us to circulate. I mean, like, if you want to be like super ultra strict about it, but I mean, I don't know. You could get paid in Bitcoin, I guess.
Keep your own money is not the same thing as me cutting you a check or me cutting a check to anyone else. Not the same thing remotely. Okay, finally, there's the idea that mass deportation is going to create inflation as well. But it's totally unclear exactly what that's going to look like. So in any case, Alan Blinder suggests that if you put all this together, the new Trump policies might add 2 to 3% to total inflation over 2 to 3.
Oh, so he just like skips. Okay. Wait, so what was his explanation? What people specifically do with the saved money? He says that they use it economically to help their family. I don't know what the that means. I don't know what that's supposed to mean. And then also deporting people is just not going to happen, I guess.
Years of
so we just like skip that whole part. Jesus.
Percentage point a year. Now, the real problem here is not going to be that. The real problem here is going to be if there's an attempt to push the Federal Reserve to continue to lower the interest rates. Right? That would be the real problem, because it turns out the Federal Reserve is generally the biggest driver of the national inflation rate. That and massive government spending. So at the same time that Trump is pushing all this, he of course is also pushing the so-called Department of Government Efficiency led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, there's only so much that Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy can actually do in terms of cutting. Right? That doesn't mean they can't do anything. It just means that it'll be a lot tougher than people think it will be. Because if you break down the American spending initiatives, the spending as a share of gross domestic product, 14.7% of our GDP is spent on mandatory programs that are already embedded in law that Trump has said he will not touch, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. When it comes to non-defense discretionary spending...
Wait. What? Did he just compare the percentage spent on mandatory programs from our GDP? Why would you... Can somebody explain why you would compare these two numbers? I guess if you wanted to know over time, maybe, but our federal budget doesn't come from our GDP. It comes from our tax revenues.
Of our GDP is spent on share of gross domestic product spending initiatives. The spending as a share of gross domestic product, 14.7% of our GDP is spent on mandatory programs that are already embedded in law that Trump has said he will not touch, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Programs that are 14.7% of our GDP is spent on mandatory programs that are already embedded in law that Trump has said he will not touch.
We don't spend our GDP on these things. The government spends its money on things. I don't understand that. I don't know. I don't even know what this statement means. I have no idea. Okay.
Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. When it comes to non-defense discretionary spending, that has remained fairly consistent in terms of its spending levels since the 1960s. And defense actually represents significantly less of the American GDP spend than it did back in the 1960s. We were spending about 9% of our GDP on defense spending back in 1960. Today, we spend about 3% on our defense spending. So this kind of thing back in 1960. Today, we spend about 9% of our GDP on defense spending back in 1960. Today, we spend about 3% on our defense spending. So this kind of bizarre notion that defense spending is what's eating up the budget, that is not true at all.
Well, no way. This is reasonable though. Tax revenues are dependent on GDP. I mean, in a tied way, but this is a dog comparison. Like, hold on. I'm sorry. Like,
so what exactly can they touch? That is not true at all. So that defense spending is what's eating up the budget, that on our defense spending. On defense spending back in 1960. Today we spend about 3% on our defense spending. So this kind of bizarre notion that defense spending is what's eating up the budget, that is not true.
This is a lie. I would just, this statement, I would just qualify this as a lie. To say that we spend 3% of our GDP on our defense budget is a lie. Factually, is it true? I guess kind of. But one, we don't spend our GDP. We don't spend our GDP. The government, that doesn't even make sense. Government spending is a component of GDP. This doesn't even make sense at all. Number one. Number two, when people talk about our defense budget being high or what we spend on defense being high, we only spend 3%. That does sound really low. But my understanding, we can look it up, I believe that when we're talking about the budget of the government, the discretionary spending portion of the budget, that's like, I think 50% or more is spent on defense. That's usually what people are talking about when they say it's high. 3% to 50% is a massively different. That's an insanely stupid discretionary budget, USA 2024, 2023 was 1.7 trillion, and was defense over 1 trillion? Approximately half of the federal discretionary spending is allocated to defense. Oh, yeah, I see. Okay, it's this whole box. Yeah. What a stupid, what a stupid point.
At all. So what exactly can they touch? Well, again, the list is relatively small. What remains is discretionary spending, according to the Wall Street Journal. That breaks down into two.
Yeah, why would you look at the total and compare spending of the discretionary to that? Wait, I can't tell if you're... Okay, never mind.
Main categories. The first, what remains, they touch? Well, again, the list is relatively small. What remains is discretionary spending, according to the Wall Street Journal. That breaks down into two main categories. The first is defense.
What?
Okay, so there's the reason government spending as a percent of GDP is important. So let's say the United States earns $100, right?
Stop. I don't need you to explain to me that the average percentage of the revenue that the government collects is always about 17% of GDP. That's not relevant. The relevant part isn't that our GDP can influence the taxes from the government. Obviously, a flourishing economy means the government collect more tax revenues. That's obviously true.
No. The issue is no. The specific issue is
hold on. No. Because whatever I'm about to say is completely irrelevant. It's just another actually you type in chat for no.
It's not actually.
It's totally irrelevant. The point is that Ben Shapiro is making it sound like we spend 2% of our budget, he said 2% of our GDP on defense. That's a point, and that's not what people complain about. And
no, that is a very, very important point. Okay, so you understand that if government, if our taxes are equal to our government expenditure, our GDP doesn't change, right? Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So,
because GDP is a calculation of all the money spent, an investment in all these different components. And if the government is taxing it, then it takes the money in so that it's not spent. But if the government spending expenditure is the same thing as our GDP, then that means that it would be a wash, right? Yes.
Yes. Yeah. And so if you're trying to compare how much we're spending over time and compared to other things that we're doing, it's important to look at government expenditure on each individual program as a percentage of GDP.
That's fine. You're going into a whole bunch of shit that doesn't matter that I don't care about that say, well, actually, when we're talking about the United States budget, we don't budget in a percentage of GDP. Now, maybe
yes, we do budget as a percentage of GDP because there's only so much of the United States protective force that you can budget without having economic impacts.
Then DM me a single article ever of a budget negotiation that talked about a percentage of GDP being spent for any of the public conversations, for any of the Congress conversations, and then I'll believe you. Shoot me a DM of it, and I'll see it, okay? Or even a Ben Shapiro talking about this in the past, and I'll believe it, okay? I want to see you either link me an article where a congressman says, even though this budget might seem high, as a percentage of GDP, it's actually in line with our prior budgets, because that doesn't happen, number one. Or number two.
Because the public conversation that happens around how budgets should actually work is irrelevant to how budgets actually need to work.
But Ben Shapiro is having a public conversation about the budget. Here's a second thing you could send me. I want you to send me a thing where Ben Shapiro says, now I know that it seems like our non-discretionary spending or our entitlements are high. However, as a percentage of GDP, they're about in line where they always have been, or they're lower than what they've always have been. So if you can show me either of those things, then I'll say, okay, that was a good well actually. Otherwise, it's a point that has nothing to do with the video. So show me either of those things and I'll believe you, okay? So a video of Ben Shapiro going, well, actually, as a percentage of GDP, our entitlement spending is really low, whereas a percentage of GDP, our Ukrainian aid or whatever is really low, rather than this is 50% of our budget or this is 100% of our tax revenues. Okay, show me that, okay? Just send me the DM and I'll believe you. Okay.
So presumably you can get rid of some of the golden toilets at the Pentagon. The second is non-defense discretionary spending, which includes everything else, which is funding for NASA, farm programs, housing assistance, and on. It's about $950 billion.
Why does Destiny hate Rage Pope so much? Because Rage Pope comes in and does the most relevant well actuallys. Like, technically, what Ben Shapiro is talking about, if we were having a good faith discussion on economics, technically, what Ben Shapiro is talking about has a large degree of truth to it. Maybe even it is a true statement, I would say. But in reality, you will never, ever hear a conservative talk about entitlement spending as a percentage of GDP ever. You will always hear about it in absolute numbers or as a percentage of our debt or as a percentage of like the total government budget. So when they're talking about things that they want to keep spending on, they'll talk about it as a percentage of GDP because that percentage is really low. But when they talk about things that they don't want to spend, all of a sudden it becomes 100% of our budget or 200% of our discretionary spending is spent on blah, blah, blah. That's the bullshit I'm talking about. Okay. So to come in here and have like the most absolute good faith charitable interpretation of a guy who just lied out his ass about impacts of tariffs on the economy is beyond. It's just another well actually. And Rage Pope dumps these into chat all the time, like the most actuallys ever, right? I'll say some shit like, yeah, if you eat 3,000 calories a day, you know, you weigh 120 pounds, you're probably not going to gain weight. And fucking Rage Pope will be in here. He'd be like, well, actually, Destiny, I know a friend who eats 3,000 calories a day and they throw half of it up at the end of the day and he's actually losing weight. So what you're saying is completely wrong because you can be bulimic and he'll be like, okay, yeah, is that true? Sure, but it's okay. He does these all the time. All right. Jesus.
So unless they're willing to touch some of the actual mandatory programs, unlikely they're going to be able to cut all that much. However, Trump's overall economic plans are to cut in particular areas to allow people to keep their own money and to use again. If tariffs are the main thing that people...
Yeah, hold on. So somebody in chat said it. I think talking about it this way is okay if you talk about every budget item in the conversation in the same way. Yes, that's why I said, show me Ben Shapiro talking about entitlement spending as a percentage of GDP, right? I would be curious to see that. I don't think he's ever done it. I think they always use the big numbers. Or the national debt as a percentage of GDP or something. Maybe, sure.
Unlikely they're going to be able to cut all that much. However, Trump's overall economic plans are to cut in particular areas to allow people to keep their own money and to use again. If tariffs are the main thing that people are worried about in terms of inflationary policy, understand Donald Trump's purpose in using tariffs is as leverage. Even the Wall Street Journal's editorial board, which is very anti-tariff and very pro-free trade, acknowledges that that's probably what Donald Trump is trying to do. They point out the president-elect issued a broadside Monday on Truth Social vowing 25% tariffs against all goods from Mexico and Canada and a new 10% tariff on imports from China. And then he said, quote, this tariff will remain in effect until such time as drugs, in particular fentanyl, and all illegal aliens stop this invasion of our country. Now, again, that is not him making a claim that tariffs are going to help the American economy. That is him making a claim that tariffs can be wielded as a tool of policy. This is part and parcel of his broader approach to foreign policy, which suggests that economic leverage is a very, very important part of getting other countries, America's geopolitical opponents, competitors, and enemies, to do what we want them to do.
While that is kind of true, there's also a macro convo here that we're not even ready to have because conservatives are f***ing mind-fucked. But the macro conversation here is that how we want to be negotiating with our allies? Like, do we want to go to Canada and Mexico? I guess we view Mexico as enemies now. I don't know. But do we want to go to Canada like, hey, we should renegotiate about our trade agreement? So we're going to go ahead and tariff all your shit by 30% unless you bend the knee and, do exactly what we want you to do. Like, is that a good approach to dealing with allies? Like,
listen, there are always people trying to take advantage of the United States. Trump is fighting back against that. And there are always people trying to take advantage of you, which is why we should talk about privacy. A few decades ago, private citizens used to be largely that, private. The internet changed everything, folks. Think about everything. You browsed, searched for, watched, tweeted. Now imagine all that data being crawled, collected, aggregated by data brokers into a permanent public record, your record. Having your private life exposed for others to see was once something only celebrities worried about. But in 2024, when everyone is online, everyone is essentially a public figure. You know who absolutely loves this new reality? The radical left. Big tech, big government, they would love to track every single move you make online.
Not to mention that all of this criticizing is being done to Trump's own trade agreement. Keep in mind that all of these threats of tariffs, like, again, and how meaningless is your word as an American negotiator, right? Imagine going up to Canada and going like, hey, what's up, Canada? Like, hey, what's up? And they're like, so we're going to tariff the out of you if you don't like change these provisions of our trade agreement. And they're like, didn't we just literally renegotiate one of the largest trade agreements in the world I think the largest like free market or the largest market in the world. Didn't we just renegotiate this like 4 or 5 years ago? And it's like, yeah, but we're just going to like ignore all of that. And we want a totally radically new thing. Like, is that how these negotiations are going to go? That every few years, we're just going to radically renegotiate or throw out every possible thing it's just insane. What an insane position to have in terms of how you relate to other countries. Jesus. Like, imagine if you wanted to trade with the United States and the U.S. was demanding you to make substantial changes to your market in order to trade. Like, they say, like, okay, you guys need a minimum wage of $4 an hour. We're not going to trade with slave labor anymore. It's not fair. It's hurting our manufacturers too much. You're like, okay, fine. And then they change it. If you were that country, would you start to make dramatic changes thinking like, well, I don't know, in 4 years, the United States might completely 180 on this trade agreement. They might change it completely. So, like, I don't know.
Close to the PragerU for open borders and socialism. If we don't reach them and change their minds, the country we know could be lost forever. Open borders and socialism for free. Also, a majority of Gen Z supports left-wing policies like open borders and socialism. If we don't reach them and change their minds, the country we know could be lost forever. PragerU is the leading nonprofit when it comes to influencing young people. Listen, we've been working closely with PragerU for legitimately years. We used to share office space with them. They do amazing.
But calling Trump a Nazi is too much. But open borders and socialism is definitely the goal of the whole Democratic Party.
As the Wall Street Journal points out, the tariff here is in service of Trump's campaign promise to reduce illegal migration and fentanyl smuggling. He vows to take unilateral executive action without any explicit legal rationale. Trump is threatening the countries, including 2 neighbors and allies, with economic harm if they don't help him solve a domestic U.S. problem. Now, again, that's the Wall Street Journal being very skeptical, but the reality is fentanyl is not just. This is where the Wall Street Journal is wrong. Fentanyl is not just a U.S. domestic problem. Not remotely. I've been down to the border. I've seen the areas where Mexican drug cartels are smuggling fentanyl over the border. They're wide open. It is a massive business for the Mexican drug cartels, and they are working with China. China has been sending over
most of the fentanyl that comes into the United States is like put into like legally traveling people, by the way. But okay, but I think he thinks it's like the Fast and Furious. They have like tunnels and the guy that hit the telephone pole and not John Cena, the other guy, Vin Diesel, are like driving cars through tunnels and flying through the air to get the fentanyl across to us.
Precursor agents for the making of fentanyl. They send them over to labs that are run by Chinese scientists in Mexico to then cook up all of those
Paul Walker, yeah,
precursors into fentanyl, and then those are shipped across the border in many cases to even Chinese distributors on the other side of the border. This is a foreign policy problem. It is not merely a domestic policy problem. As the Wall Street Journal points out, he tried a version of this in his first term to coerce Mexico into assisting him in better policing the border, and he liked the result. Mexico went along with the Remain in Mexico program that held migrants on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande while they awaited asylum rulings. Okay, now, again, that is correct. That is what Trump is actually did asylum rulings, along with the Remain in Mexico program that held migrants on the Mexican side of the Rio Grande while they awaited asylum rulings. Okay, now, again, that is correct. That is what Trump is actually doing. And I think that all of the worries that what he's attempting to do is remake the entire global trading system, that's a lot of rot. Look at the people he's actually appointing to high positions of economic power in his administration. Scott Bessent is not somebody who's going to simply erect Smoot-Hawley tariffs. It was like the 1930 tariffs that helped exacerbate the Great Depression. He's not. Donald Trump wants to win. He does not want high inflation, and he does not want low growth, both of which would be the impact of massive across-the-board tariffs without any reference to concessions from the other side. You're already, by the way, seeing the impact. So, for example, Mexico is now getting cold feet over a new Chinese electric vehicle plant after Donald Trump's win. This is according to the Wall Street Journal. Chinese electric vehicle maker BYD is finalizing plans for a factory in Mexico, a push that will test Donald Trump's trade policies and the Mexican government's appetite for conflict with the president-elect. BYD officials say the company is aiming to reach a deal with Mexico state officials to break ground on a factory near one of the automotive hubs in central or northern Mexico.
Wait, would our trade agreements even affect these things though? Because isn't the whole point of the U.S. Mexico Canada trade agreement to get parts that are made in Mexico, Canada, or the United States? Like this wouldn't even be impacted by if Canada or if China was building the factory in Mexico. No, like what?
The plans put Mexico in a dilemma made worse by Trump's threats to impose a 25% tariff on Mexican goods.
Oh, we're just going to tariff our. We're just going to tariff our trading partners. My bad. It wasn't about things from China. It's going to be everybody.
I appreciate that, Destiny.
All right, bye.
Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.